Yeah, I think you mentioned that there was a lot of end of life questions when we were talking before this. So can you talk a little bit about what are some of the most common ones in that area and how you respond to them?
Yeah. So it's true that the Catholic Church, we believe in defensive life from conception to natural death, and there are many fewer people who are confused about abortion or beginning of life issues because the Church is very clear about where we stand on that. At the end of life, we're also clear about euthanasia and assisted suicide, being completely against that. But there are a lot of options at the end of life. A lot of different experimental treatments that are possible, a lot of different life support that's possible, a lot of different things that, have a subjective component in terms of how the person themselves experiences them. And some people feel, gosh, I just can't stand this treatment. And am I really morally required to do so? And so there are a lot of more questions that arise between what is ordinary and what is extraordinary. And that's a distinction that's made in Catholic ethics, Catholic moral theology, where we say, the ordinary means of preserving our lives are obligatory. So you're required on pain of sin not to commit suicide and to take care of your health. So, as some would say, if you're smoking heavily or you're drinking heavily, etc., you're damaging your health, you're actually committing a sin. So you have a responsibility to do the ordinary things, but at the end of life, there are a lot more questions that arise. Is this truly ordinary or is it becoming extraordinary because this person is so fragile, so close to death? Do we really need to do this, that, and the other? And it can be a real question, a real quandary. So we try to help people with that. About half of the questions that come in are these kind of end-of-life issues, particularly as individuals are coming close to death. And even like nutrition and hydration at the end, obviously food and water are ordinary means. Mm-hmm. But if the person is actively dying, do you need to insert a feeding tube? If they're no longer able to swallow, et cetera? It really depends on the circumstances. And so, again, that's one area where our ethicists can be very, very helpful. And there can be a lot of, constructive dialogue and understanding. And people just, feel very guilty if they feel like they've made the wrong decision. And so it's kind of very comforting for many people, and including pastors will reach out to us, priests, saying, I'm just not sure what to counsel people in this specific circumstance. And the circumstances definitely matter as to whether something is ordinary or extraordinary. So we field a lot of those questions and help a lot of people get peace of mind that, this is truly what a Catholic perspective is on these things.
Can you go back to the feeding tube example? Like, when would a feeding tube, if someone is actively dying, is that a situation, like, can you just give an example of when it would be ordinary or if it's ever extraordinary, how that would work?
Correct. Yeah, so this was a big debate in the 1990s.
Okay.
And there were a lot of people saying, look, the use of a feeding tube is an artificial means to keep a person alive, and it should be considered something like a ventilator, some kind of external support, and could be withdrawn without any problem. And the church looked at that and said, no. All right, St. John Paul II in particular, and he responded to the U.S. Catholic bishops because it was a major debate here within the United States. Should, a person be given a feeding tube or not? And there were a lot of arguing that, well, not necessarily, but then they were dying of dehydration or malnutrition. And so he responded very clearly that whether with a feeding tube or other artificial means, or just regular feeding, nutrition and hydration are ordinary means. However, there are some specific circumstances where that can become extraordinary. And so the clearest example is if the person is no longer able to absorb the food or the water. So say their intestines have shut down to the point where if you're giving them food, it's just piling up and it could actually hasten their death, as opposed to, it's not performing the function that it's there to do to sustain their lives. If the person's kidneys have shut down such that they can't process, the hydration, the water, again, those circumstances would make it optional and maybe even contraindicated, right? Because it would actually speed up their deaths to do that. If the person is in the dying process to where it's clear that they're going to be dying within the next 24, 48 hours, and there's a burden to inserting a feeding tube or continuing with the feeding and the hydration. And it's clear the person is not going to die of dehydration in the next 2 days, and so you're actually reducing the burdens on them without causing their death. And that's kind of the key point, right? Is that no person should die of dehydration or malnutrition that can be prevented from doing so. And so we, as a church, just don't want to see that happen. It's considered ordinary means to keep that person alive. However, there could be specific circumstances where that becomes extraordinary because it's not really performing its function. Unfortunately, there are a lot of circumstances where people are being dehydrated to death, and it's kind of a stealth euthanasia. And, or they could be fed, but they're just not because it's inconvenient in some way. And that clearly would be a problem. So we definitely have to distinguish the cases there, but it's key to understand that in almost all circumstances, it is ordinary care. It's preserving the person's life, and we never want them to be dying of dehydration or dying of malnutrition. But in certain specific circumstances, it could be justified.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting that, I mean, it makes sense that if your body isn't able to actually absorb the food, that it wouldn't actually be helpful. But it's good, I guess, to be able to have that resource where you can ask in this circumstance, is this something that's necessary or not? Right. And I think, what do you do for people who call, like, when they say they don't think they're able to trust their doctors? Like, I think you mentioned that you do run into that circumstance. How do you help them?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a big problem that I think is kind of growing, right? Is that the culture of death has kind of seeped into a lot of our institutions, a lot of our medical establishment. And so individuals are being told one thing by their doctors, and they're not exactly sure that that's accurate, that they should be withdrawing life support because the patient is going to be dying anyway, et cetera. And they're just not sure if it's true. Or if the information that they're being given is being guided by, insurance or reimbursement or something else besides the Hippocratic Oath and the pro-life principles that are out there. And so one of the things that they will do is reach out to us, and we can't, give them all the medical information, et cetera, but we can certainly give them the principles and let them know that they should be trying to get pro-life doctors to understand. Sometimes it also comes up with the issue of brain death. Mm-hmm. They're being told that their loved one is actually dead and they want to take the organs, et cetera. And there's a big debate out there, about whether or not the brain death criteria are properly applied and how that really works, et cetera. And so sometimes they just want to get some very clear principles as to what's going on and to try and understand, what they should be doing from a Catholic perspective, because they're not really getting good advice just from the medical side. And so we try to help in those circumstances. But it's a problem. We had one individual, she called us up, and she was told that her mother was dying, that they wanted to withdraw life support because they didn't think she was going to be surviving very long, and there was really no hope of recovery. And so she agreed to withdraw life support. And she thought it was kind of like a do not resuscitate order or something like that. And, that they wouldn't put her on extraordinary machines and the rest of it. And her mother was still alive several days later, and she found out that they were not feeding her, not giving her any hydration. So she was essentially being starved and dehydrated to death. And she was like, well, wait a second. I said, life support, but obviously feed her and give her nutrition. And they were like, no, that's part of life support, and we took it all off. This is in California. And so we're like, absolutely, that is completely unacceptable. You need to, force them to do that, or change her from one institution to another where you can trust the doctors, et cetera. But that's the sort of thing that tends to happen in some very bad extreme examples.
Well, it seems like in that case, too, they're using vague language. Like they're saying life support, and then what you think of as life support isn't necessarily what the doctors are thinking of as life support.
Correct. Yeah. So sometimes the terminology and even, the pressure that is put on some families. So they're told you have to make this decision now, in the next hour. And they need to process and think and figure out what's going on. And so sometimes, that's when we get these emergency calls. It's like, we have to make this decision. We don't know what's going on, and it's very difficult. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we tell them, look, they can't force you. Take some more time. You have to. I mean, there are true emergencies where they have to make a decision right away. And at that point, you just kind of have to trust that they're going to make the right decision. But a lot of these decisions, there is a little bit of time, even if there is time pressure being put on them. But it makes a lot of sense to try and reflect and come to a good decision, as opposed to just kind of a knee-jerk reaction or just doing whatever you're being proposed. Because again, even in some Catholic hospital situations, the advice that's given might not be the right advice for that family as they're discerning. There's a lot of freedom, particularly when it comes to ordinary and extraordinary means. On the extraordinary side, there's a lot of freedom to choose one way or another. And they should be able to make that informed decision.